That fateful night, Elizabeth Canning has a flashback. New Year's Day, 1753, 9 p.m. Elizabeth was wearing her holiday best, a purple gown, a white handkerchief and apron, a black petticoat, a green undercoat, black shoes, blue stockings, and a white shaving hat with green ribbons. Elizabeth was last seen in Houndsditch after leaving her aunt's house on New Year's Day.
Thank you so much, Aunt Collie. Have a great New Year's.
Bye, Elizabeth. Have a safe trip home. Let me know if your brother likes the mince pie.
10 p.m. People start running in and attacking Elizabeth, taking her hat, gown, and apron. They forcefully drag her down the street.
Help!
Do as we do here and you will be fine.
Elizabeth was forcefully dragged into a small room with nothing but a loaf of bread and water and a broken pitcher.
I just want to go home.
There is bread and water. If you come out of this room, your throat will be slit.
Elizabeth stayed in this room for a month. She was starved and terrified about her captors.
Sorry, brother. I need this mince pie. It'll do me more good than it will you.
Elizabeth looked for an escape, and on January 29th, she finally had a plan to escape.
Ow! I'm free!
Elizabeth wandered home on January 29th, and upon her arriving at her house, her mother was horrified by the girl that stood in front of her. Elizabeth was bleeding, bowed double, ragged, and she was in a filthy jacket and a petticoat with a cloth around her head. Elizabeth comes out of the flashback.
Some argue that the case made by Elizabeth Canning is a hoax, but we urge you to look at the facts and figure out how something like this could have happened.
So, fact number one is Elizabeth's condition upon her return home. Upon returning to her home the night of her escape, her family and neighbors immediately described her when she came in the door as being emaciated, ragged, slow to speak, and bloody in her ear. So the injuries described by these first-hand accounts, actually, with her voice being low, her pulse scarcely to be felt, and with cold sweats. These kind of conditions are very difficult to induce upon oneself, and especially because in Elizabeth Canning's case, she was described by her employers and neighbors and family as being valuing integrity and honesty, meaning that she would not be the type of person to fake such a thing, and especially because becoming emaciated and ragged and such things are pretty difficult to do, self-inflicted at least. You have to have lots of motivation, which she simply doesn't have, considering her the judgment of her character provided by the rest of her family and neighbors and such.
Fact 2 is Elizabeth's history, and going back on the previous fact, Elizabeth was regarded highly by her friends, family, neighbors, and peers. Her years in service with Mr. Wintleberry, as well as Mr. Lyon, have shown her high character for modesty, integrity, honesty, and reserve. And with this, from an article that described her character, it shows how this girl has been in years in service with Mr. Wintleberry, and he gave her highest character for honesty and reserve. And not only did she attend the customers at the bar, she kept to herself. She had no young man. She only left for Mr. Wintleberry for a better place at Mr. Lyon's. And even then, Mr. Lyon continued upon the points of modesty and honesty. And with these first-hand sources, we see that the truth above mentioned by these facts, these names have been people that have known Elizabeth Canning and from her birth, and have always thought of her as being proper, honest, and a industrious girl who are ready to attest.
Our third fact is that Elizabeth, due to a pre-existing condition, was known to have bouts of unconsciousness because when she was younger, she had a ceiling fall on her head, which led to unconsciousness, obviously, kind of like a concussion. For the rest of her life, it it was affecting her, and in this case she's known to have blacked out after being attacked when she's in the woods, so she has no idea where she is, and this is a good reason for why she would not remember all of the facts until prompted, because if you're blacked out for half of it, then you do not know what is happening. So from this existing condition, you see that Elizabeth could have dreamt something, made up something, you don't know, because she was being prompted by other people from her inability to remember.
And if you go back, actually, the example on the right, drawn from Echo, actually shows that the two men that seized her did give her a blow to the head, which triggered one of her fits. So it's very reasonable to think that she would have had some memory loss or confusion during the entire ordeal over the course of a month. Okay, and then we're going to describe where we are now. So the first trial has already been conducted, convicting Mary Squires and Susanna Wells of theft and kidnapping. However, some of the Egyptians of the town have assembled under Lord Crisp Gascoigne and have investigated have begun another investigation against Elizabeth Canning, attempting to try her for perjury. So we're going to pass out these broadsides that were created very recently. So Elizabeth Canning is to be tried this April. And we are going to move on with some of the counter arguments made from the Egyptian side.
All right, so our first counter argument against the Egyptians and accusers of Elizabeth Canning of perjury is a leading the witness argument. So Elizabeth was described by her employers and family as being a reserved type. She was never this like a seeker of attention or anything like that. She was never the subject of very much attention. But immediately when she arrived home that night of her escape, she became an almost celebrity in the community and beyond, where she was hounded by everybody to find out what happened. But she was traumatized. She was kind of shy, I suppose. She was traumatized. She had, of course, forgotten things, that she had her fits during during the event. She didn't remember everything perfectly. What she did provide them with was the street that she came back on. And many of the Canningites were able to draw their own conclusions from that due to pre-established biases they had against groups like the Gypsies, knowing that Squires and Wells lived in that house, which they believed to already be an unclean place, which may have been a brothel or other sort of just bad place. They believed that, well, it must have been them. And this is what they're believed to have told Elizabeth, who then, in her condition, was just not in a situation to necessarily deny these things. She was confused. So she proceeded to go along with these beliefs of the Canningites when they may not have necessarily been true. Also, there's the issue of the false memories that she may have created as a result of blacking out during the whole event. This issue are the reason why today, during investigations, investigators have to use super open-ended questions. They don't risk leading the witness in situations, because it has been shown that when somebody's experienced a traumatic event, it's easy to implant false memories through asking, through certain suggestions or asking certain questions, certain ways. So our other counterpoint here is Sir Crisp Gascoigne's biases against Elizabeth Canning. So Sir Crisp Gascoigne was the one who was attempting to do this investigation for perjury, but he was not necessarily in a position to be doing this, as he had a bit too much stake in the outcome of this. He was known for advocating for the defenseless, and thus finding Canning guilty and proving a gypsy, whom nobody really wanted to support, innocent, would have upheld this reputation. In the past, he had argued on the behalf of London's homeless children, who were also kind of seen as a nuisance at the time. He also believed that the Canningites had acted improperly in their support of Canning due to their lower class, whereas there were a couple people who had vouched for Wells and squires that were a little bit more high class in some other places. So he was more inclined to believe what they said, as opposed to all of the Canningites, just simply due to their class. Lastly, he also felt that the Canningites were threatening his political legitimacy through just corroborating her stories, because he believed that they were all lying, essentially, simply to spite him and get him out of a political position. So essentially, he had to find her guilty, or otherwise it would completely ruin him.
And lastly, the opposition would bring up why didn't Elizabeth stop anywhere on the way home? If she was lost, she didn't know where she was from her previous statements. So how did she get home, and why didn't she get help getting home? And from one of the interviews that we saw during the trial, she was asked, did you not know where you were the entire time? And she said, I didn't at first, but then I saw a coach go by, and if you know, sometimes you're in a place that you don't really know where you are, but maybe you recognize a tree or some other type of landmark, and you see, oh, that's where I am, so I know the general direction, and if I walk this way, maybe I'll get home. So that's how she perceived to find her way home. And the reason that she didn't stop on the way home to ask for help was because she didn't know the people around where she was. If she had stopped at a house, maybe she would have been brought back to her captors. She wasn't sure who she could trust in this situation, because think about it, she had been locked up for a month with no food. She's on the verge of death, and she wants to get home whichever way she can, and the fastest way possible.
Okay, so here we have quite a long excerpt from a document derived from Echo, and I'm going to read a little blurb of it. It basically describes the condition that Elizabeth was brought home and how it's a clear indication of her suffering. It says, the house of that notorious woman, well known by the name of Mother Wells, appears to be in dismal prison of this unhappy sufferer, whose melancholy situation since her miraculous escape is worthy of the compassion and charitable contributions of all public-spirited people, and every one who has any regard for the safety of their own children and relations, who are equally liable to the same inhuman and cruel usage as the before-mentioned young person, who, since her escape from that house of that monster of a woman, has been in the most deplorable condition, has been deprived of the natural effects of food, having nothing passed through her since being first buried away in the manner before mentioned. It talks about how she actually didn't urinate for a week after she got back, which is clear indication that she was deprived of food, water, and basic care. And here's one of the quotes that I had just read.
So this quote reads, "Since her miraculous escape is worthy of the compassions and charitable contributions of all public-spirited people, and every one who has regard for the safety of their own children and relations, who are equally liable for the same inhuman, cruel usage."
You're on the right side of history and join the Canningites. That's it. Any questions?
So the large passage that you read, who wrote that?
It was derived from like a collection of papers regarding the trials of Elizabeth Canning. So it probably would have been one of the writers like that were at the trial.
Probably Henry Fielding.
Yeah.
Probably Henry Fielding. He was
Yeah.
one of the investigators on the whole, for the first trial involving Wells and
Go to the source slide.
Squires.
It'll say. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's Henry Fielding. I'm not sure if he was listed.
Yeah, it should be one of the, it's definitely one of those. I think it's a clear case, statement of the case of Elizabeth Canning.
Yeah.
What were Fielding's qualifications involved in the trial?
So he was already an investigator. He was a justice of the peace, I believe. He'd been doing it for quite a long time. He wasn't just appointed by them or anything like that. He was qualified to be in that position. He was legally supposed to be there. He was sort of like a lawyer investigator sort of person. Things were different back then. But yeah, Sir Crisp Gascoigne, I believe, oversaw the entire thing, and he was the one who eventually decided to take it to a further investigation.
Any other questions? Yes.
So Gascoigne was the trial judge for the perjury trial, the second trial, right?
He was not for the second trial, actually.
Oh, he was for the first trial?
He was. So he investigated her,
Okay.
but for the second trial, he actually was no longer in that position, because I think he was Lord Mayor of London,
Yeah.
or something like that. And Elizabeth actually didn't turn herself in for that trial until after he was out of that position and somebody else was in charge. Because I believe she believed that he was so biased against her that there was no chance.
Okay. Yeah, I asked because it seemed incredibly biased on the case of the
Yeah.
judge to be the one like advocating for a new trial.
He was.
Yeah.
That's why she waited so long.
And then was tried in absentia, or no?
Define.
What, was she present for the second trial?
She
or?
was, yes.
Okay, so the trial didn't occur until after she
It did
turned
not
herself
occur
in,
until she turned herself in.
and she hid until he was no longer in charge.
Exactly.
Really
Canning.
Any other questions?
All right. Thank you very much. Well done.